Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to read something to you. My eye is kind of bloody looking, so I really don't think it's a good idea to sit there and talk before a camera, but I wanted to read to you something. It's wonderful. It's from the National Review of March 1st, 1993, and it's entitled 56 BC and All That. And what this is teachers from all over the country have sent in various things that students had written in their term papers from 8th grade through college, and it's remarkable what a travesty history can be. So I will start here. It's 2 pages long, and I think you'll find it rather amusing. Ancient Greece was inhabited by mummies, and they all wrote in hydraulics. They lived in the Sahara Desert and traveled by Camelot. The climate of the Sahara is such that the inhabitants have to live elsewhere, so certain areas of the desert are cultivated by irrigation. Early Egyptian women wore a garment called a solaris. It was a sheer dress which started beneath the breasts, which hung to the floor. The pyramids are a range of mountains between France and Spain. The Egyptians built the pyramids in the shape of huge triangular cubes. The Bible is full of interesting caricatures. In the first book of the Bible, Genesis, Adam and Eve were created from an apple tree. One of their children, Cain, asked, "Am I my brother's son?" God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Montezuma. Jacob, son of Isaac, stole his brother's birthmark. Jacob was a patriarch who brought up his 12 sons to be patriarchs. But they did not take to it. One of Jacob's sons, Joseph, gave refuge to the Israelites. Moses led the Hebrew slaves to the Red Sea, where they made unleavened bread, which is bread made without any ingredients. Afterwards, Moses went up to Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments. He died before he ever reached Canada. David was a Hebrew king skilled at playing the lyre. He fought with the Philistines, a race of people who lived in biblical times. Solomon, one of David's sons, had 300 wives and 700 porcupines. Later came Job, who had one trouble after another. Eventually, he lost all of his cattle and all of his children and had to go live alone with his wife in the desert. The Greeks were a highly sculptured people, and without them, we wouldn't have history. The Greeks also had myths. A myth is a female moth. One myth says that the mother of Achilles dipped him into the river Styx until he became intolerable. Achilles appears in the Iliad by Homer. Homer also wrote the Odyssey, in which Penelope was the last hardship that Ulysses endured on his journey. Actually, Homer was not written by Homer, but by another man of that name. Socrates was a famous Greek teacher who went around giving people advice. They killed him. Socrates died from an overdose of wedlock. After his death, his career suffered a dramatic decline. In the Olympic Games, Greeks ran races, jumped, hurled the biscuits, and threw the Java. The reward to the victors was a coral reef. Eventually, the Romans conquered the Greeks. History calls people Romans because they never stayed in one place for a very long time. Julius Caesar extinguished himself on the battlefields of Gaul. The Ides of March murdered him because they thought he was going to be made king. Nero was a very cruel tyranny who would torture his poor subjects by playing the fiddle to them. Rome came to have too many luxuries and baths. At Roman banquets, the guests wore garlics in their hair. They took 2 baths in 2 days, and that's the cause of the fall of Rome. Rome was invaded by ball bearings and is full of falling arches today. Then came the Middle Ages, when everyone was middle-aged. King Alfred conquered the Danes. King Arthur lived in an age of chivalry with brave knights on prancing horses and beautiful women. King Harold mustered his troops before the Battle of Hastings. Joan of Arc was burned to a stake and was canonized by Bernard Shaw. And victims of the blue bonnet plague grew boobs on their necks. Finally, Magna Carta provided that no free man should be hanged twice for the same offense. In medieval times, most people were illiterate. The greatest writer of the feudal ages was Chaucer, who wrote many poems and verses and also wrote literature. During this time, people put on morality plays about ghosts, goblins, virgins, and other strange creatures. Another story was about William Tell, who shot an arrow through an apple while standing on his son's head. The Renaissance was an age in which more individuals felt the value of their human being. Martin Luther was nailed to a church door in Wittenberg for selling papal indulgences and died a horrible death, being excommunicated by a bull. It was the winter Donatello's interest in the feudal nude that made him the father of the Renaissance. The government of England was a united mockery. From the womb of Henry VIII, Protestantism was born, and he found walking difficult because he had an abscess on his knee. Queen Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen. As a queen, she was a success. Then Elizabeth exposed herself before her troops. They all shouted, "Hurrah!" Then her navy went out and defeated the Spanish armadillo. It was an age of great inventions and discoveries. Gutenberg invented movable type and the Bible. Another important invention was the circulation of blood. Sir Walter Raleigh, a historic figure because he invented cigarettes and started smoking. And Sir Francis Drake circumcised the world with a 100-foot clipper. The greatest writer of the Renaissance was William Shakespeare. Shakespeare was born in the year 1564, supposedly on his birthday. He never made much money and is famous only because of his plays. He wrote tragedies, comedies, and hysterectomies, all in Islamic parameters. In one of Shakespeare's famous plays, Hamlet rations out his situation by relieving himself in a long soliloquy. His mind is filled with the filth of the incestuous sheets which he pores over every time he sees his mother. In another play, Lady Macbeth tries to convince Macbeth to kill the king by attacking his manhood. the clown in As You Like It named Touchdown, and Romeo and Juliet are an example of a heroic couplet. Romeo's last wish was to be laid by Juliet. Writing at the same time of Shakespeare was Miguel Cervantes. He wrote Don Quixote. The next great author was John Milton. Milton wrote Paradise Lost. Then his wife died, and he wrote Paradise Regained. Christopher Columbus was a great navigator who discovered America while cursing about the Atlantic. His ships were called the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Fe. Later, the Pilgrims crossed the ocean, and this was called Pilgrim's Progress. The winter of 1620 was a hard one for the settlers. Many people died, and many babies were born. Captain John Smith was responsible for all of this. One of the causes of the Revolutionary War was that the English put tacks in their tea. Also, the colonists would send their parcels to the post without stamps. During the war, the Redcoats and Paul Revere were throwing balls over stone walls. The dogs were barking and the peacocks crowing. Finally, the colonists won the war and no longer had to pay for taxis. Delegates from the original 13 states formed the Contented Congress. Thomas Jefferson, a virgin, and Benjamin Franklin were two singers of the Declaration of Independence. Franklin invented electricity by rubbing two cats backwards and declared, "A horse divided against itself cannot stand." Franklin died in 1790 and is still dead. George Washington married Martha Custis, and in due time became the father of our country. His farewell address was Mount Vernon. Soon the Constitution of the United States was adopted to secure domestic hostility. Under the Constitution, the people enjoyed the right to keep bar arms. Okay. Abraham Lincoln became America's greatest president. Lincoln's mother died in infancy, and he was born in a log cabin which he built with his own hands. Lincoln said, "In onion there is strength." Abraham Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address while traveling to Washington to Gettysburg on the back of an envelope. He also freed the slaves by signing the Emasculation Proclamation. On the night of April 14th, 1865, Lincoln went to the theater and got shot in his seat by one of the actors in the moving picture show. The believed assassinator was John Wilkes Booth, a supposedly insane actor. This ruined Booth's career. Meanwhile, in Europe, the enlightened Voltaire invented electricity and also wrote a book called Candy. Gravity was invented by Isaac Walton, and chiefly noticeable in the autumn when the apples are falling off the trees. Johann Bach wrote many great musical compositions and had a large number of children. In between, he practiced on an old spinster, which he kept up in his attic. Bach died from 1750 to the present. Bach was the most famous composer in the world, and so was Handel. Handel was half German, half Italian, half English. He was very large. Beethoven wrote music even though he was deaf. He was so deaf, he wrote loud music. He took long walks in the forest, even when everyone was calling for him. Beethoven expired in 1827 and later died for this. France was in a very serious state. The French Revolution was accomplished before it happened, catapulting into Napoleon. During the Napoleonic Wars, the crowned heads of Europe were trembling in their shoes. From the hills and nipped at Napoleon's flanks. Napoleon wanted an heir to inherit his power, but since Josephine was a baroness, she couldn't have children. The sun never set on the British Empire because the British Empire is in the east and the sun sets in the west. Queen Victoria was the longest queen. She sat on a throne for 63 years. She was a moral woman who practiced virtue. Her death was the final event which ended her reign. The 19th century was a time of a great many thoughts and inventions. People stopped reproducing by hand and started reproducing by machine. The invention of the steamboat caused a network of rivers to spring up. Cyrus McCormick invented the McCormick Raper, which did the work of 100 men. Louis Pasteur discovered a cure for rabies. Charles Darwin was a naturalist who wrote The Organ of the Species. Madman Curie discovered radio, and Karl Marx became one of the Marx brothers. The First World War caused by the assassination of the Archduke by an anarchist ushered in a new era in the annals of human history. Well, there we are. A little bit of a history lesson by a bunch of students from 8th grade through college. And I can recall when I was teaching, it was fascinating to read what a lot of my students would write on term papers. We had a lot of fun and we had a lot of laughs. And I hope you have a couple of laughs out of this. Thank you very much.